So, what if the political spectrum, the one you've been taught to believe in your entire life, is actually just a complete illusion?
Right, that straight horizontal line we all picture,
Mhm.
left on one side, right on the other.
Exactly. I mean, we spend so much time obsessing over that line. We treat modern politics well, like we are arguing over the operating system of a computer.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
One side is screaming that we need this open source system focused on community equity, and the other side is demanding a closed, highly secure system focused on tradition, right?
Right, they're focused on efficiency.
Okay, let's unpack this because we get so consumed by this vicious binary debate over the software that we completely fail to notice the person walking into the server room.
The person holding a giant electromagnet.
Exactly. A giant electromagnet just preparing to fry the hard drive and basically burn the entire building to the ground.
Because what's fascinating here is they do not care if the system runs on progressive or conservative code. They are entirely focused on the destruction of the hardware itself.
And that profound vulnerability, that is our mission for today's deep dive. We are going to completely dismantle that traditional narrative of the political left and right.
It's so necessary right now.
It really is, because every time you turn on the news, you are sold this hyper-simplified story of an epic battle between capitalism and socialism, red and blue.
Conservatives and liberals.
Yeah. But today, we're diving into a framework that argues this horizontal tug of war is dangerously misleading. The real enemy of a functioning society isn't the person sitting across the aisle from you.
No, it's not.
The actual threat, that person holding the electromagnet in the server room, is populism.
And to unpack this, we are relying entirely on the brilliant and, frankly, pretty unsettling architecture built by Herman Forwood.
Yes, Herman Forwood.
We're exploring his landmark text, The Populist Trap, why extremism is not an ideology. Because Forwood is attempting to hand us a completely new pair of glasses, basically, to view human history and our current political chaos.
That subtitle alone, Why Extremism is Not an Ideology, I mean, that is such a massive paradigm shift.
It really is.
We're conditioned to treat radicalism as this deeply held set of beliefs. We just assume someone on the far fringes has read a lot of very intense philosophical literature and arrived at this rigid policy stance.
But Forwood completely strips all of that away.
Yeah.
He argues that we are fundamentally misdiagnosing the disease here.
How so?
Well, we study extremism by analyzing its supposed policy goals, right? We look for some underlying intellectual framework. But Forwood demonstrates that extremism is not an ideology at all. It is a methodology.
A methodology, so it's a tool.
Exactly. It's a tool of demolition. And the raw fuel that powers that demolition is populism. It's the tactical weaponization of public anger against the complexity of the system itself.
Wow. Okay, so before we get into the historical case studies and the actual mechanics of how this works, we need to set some parameters for you, our listeners.
Ground rules.
We know you're tuning in to make sense of an overwhelmingly noisy partisan world. Our job today is strictly to act as your guides through Forwood's research.
We're just mapping it out.
Exactly. We will map out his visual models, dissect his historical examples, and look at modern manifestations on both the left and the right exactly as Forwood presents them. We are not here to endorse a political party.
And we're definitely not here to tell you who to vote for.
Right. We are operating purely as analysts of Forwood's terrain.
We're going to look under the hood of these political movements to really understand the machinery of populism while remaining entirely neutral regarding the specific partisan flavors it adopts.
So let's redefine the battlefield. Forwood suggests that to see the trap clearly, we first have to establish a baseline.
A baseline of what standard institutional politics actually looks like right now in the year 2026.
Right. He strips away all that apocalyptic rhetoric and just looks at what the traditional left and the traditional right are actually doing on a day-to-day basis.
And he paints a very pragmatic picture of the institutionalists. When you look at the political left in 2026, you see a coalition pushing for sweeping systemic changes.
Big, complex issues.
Massive ones. They are mitigating climate change, attempting to overhaul the healthcare apparatus, strengthening labor rights in a gig economy, and drafting policies aimed at widespread social equity.
But the critical defining feature of this institutional left is, well, it's how they are trying to achieve those goals.
Yes, methodology.
They are using the pre-existing tools of the democratic system. They're writing these 1,000-page bills.
Haggling in subcommittees for months.
Exactly, fighting over judicial appointments and regulatory frameworks. They are fundamentally playing by the established rules of the legislative game.
And when Forwood examines the institutional right in his 2026 baseline, he finds the exact same methodological commitment.
The exact same playbook.
Yes. The political right is focused on passing long-process legislation to advance their specific worldview. They are navigating the bureaucracy to secure corporate tax cuts, structurally reinforcing the military, and working through the courts to integrate Christian ideologies or traditional values into the public sphere.
They're also drafting bills, sitting in endless hearings, dealing with lobbyists. So here is the million-dollar question.
Let's hear it.
If both the institutional left and the institutional right are basically just trying to govern, if they are both fundamentally committed to the bureaucratic machinery of democracy, why are voters so furious with them?
It's palpable, isn't it?
Yeah. Why is there this intense sense across the entire country that the institutionalists are just failing completely?
Well, this is where Forwood identifies the core vulnerability of a republic. It comes down to the deliberate architecture of democracy itself.
The design.
Right. The institutional process is designed to be slow. It is agonizingly, painfully slow. It requires friction.
So much friction.
It requires debate, multiple layers of approval, judicial review, and ultimately, compromise. A bill might take years to go from just an idea to an enacted law.
Which is theoretically great for preventing tyranny, I guess, but absolutely terrible for public relations.
Precisely. Because consider the perspective of a voter who is hurting right now. Imagine someone who cannot afford their groceries, or someone whose community has been devastated by opioid addiction or industrial collapse.
They're in crisis.
They are experiencing acute, immediate pain. They are demanding fast, dramatic intervention. To that voter, the slow, grinding, multi-year process of institutional reform does not look like progress at all.
No, it looks identical to a corrupt elite just defending a broken status quo.
That is a devastating insight from Forwood.
It makes total sense, though. If you are drowning today, you don't care that the Coast Guard is conducting a 6-month environmental review on the structural integrity of the lifeboats.
You just want a lifeboat.
Exactly. And the institutionalists are basically standing on the shore saying, we hear you, but we have to follow the procurement protocols.
It inherently makes the people trying to operate the system look completely out of touch, even if their policies are ultimately designed to help the person who is drowning.
And Forwood argues this perpetual frustration is the precise vulnerability that allows the fringes to hijack the narrative, right?
Yes, the institutionalists lose the emotional argument because they are speaking the language of bureaucracy to a public feeling the adrenaline of crisis. This opens the door wide for the revolutionaries.
And this marks Forwood's massive distinction between the institutionalists and the extremes. The institutional left and right are trying to steer the ship. The far left and the far right do not want to steer.
They are openly revolutionary.
They are focused on dismantling the hull of the ship while it is in the water, usually with this vague promise that once it sinks, a much better ship will just magically appear from the wreckage.
They capitalize on the frustration with the slow pace of reform by declaring that reform itself is a fool's errand. They argue the system is fundamentally irredeemable and must be destroyed.
Often invoking some idealized, fictionalized past that we need to resurrect, or a utopian future we must aggressively manifest.
Exactly.
But hold on, I think a lot of people would argue with that characterization. If you listen to the loudest voices on the political fringes, they don't usually walk up to a microphone and declare themselves agents of chaos.
No, of course not.
They don't say, vote for me, I want to sink the ship. They frame their radicalism as the only authentic way to fix the problems that the institutionalists are supposedly ignoring.
They absolutely use the language of repair, but Forwood demands we look at the mechanics of their proposals rather than the rhetoric. He provides highly specific examples of how the extremes on both sides weaponize this revolutionary energy.
Right, let's look at those.
When you analyze their actual demands, you see they are abandoning viable governance in favor of pure demolition.
Let's break down those examples, starting with the left.
So Forwood points to the modern calls on the far left to abolish the police overnight. Now, he is very careful to distinguish this from the institutional left's desire for police reform or accountability or reallocating municipal funds.
He's isolating the extreme version.
Yes, he is focusing specifically on the populist demand to entirely eradicate the institution of law enforcement immediately, without any functional, viable replacement strategy in place to ensure public safety.
So it is literally a demand for a vacuum.
Yes. It is a revolutionary impulse. The institutional work of building a new, equitable public safety apparatus would take decades of careful legislative and community building.
Right, the slow grind.
But the populist demand skips all that hard work and goes straight to the demolition, completely ignoring the catastrophic reality of what happens to a community when the existing system is abruptly shattered.
And when Forwood looks at the right, he zeroes in on election denialism and the weaponization of border hysteria.
Correct. He points out that when a political faction adopts election denialism, not just as a complaint, but as an actual governing platform, they have ceased to participate in democratic mechanics.
Because the system relies on accepting the results.
Exactly. If the only valid election is one that you win, you are no longer operating within the system. You are actively dismantling the foundational trust required for the institution of voting to exist at all.
You are telling the public that the scoreboard itself is rigged, which means the game cannot be played.
That's a great analogy.
It is the exact same methodological dismantling as the far left example, just applied to a different institution. The goal isn't to pass a better election security law. The goal is to shatter the framework of reality.
And while partisans will argue endlessly over which side is more dangerous on any given Tuesday, Forwood's historical analysis suggests that this is a cyclical trap.
A cycle of escalation.
Yes. One extreme normalizes the tactic of demolition, and the other extreme eventually adopts it and escalates it.
Which brings us to the engine of this entire process. If the institutional grind is slow and boring, how do these fringe elements actually capture the imagination of millions of people?
It takes a lot of energy.
It really does. How do you convince a massive portion of the population to actively cheer for the destruction of their own institutions? You need a remarkably potent fuel.
And Forwood identifies that fuel as populism.
He defines populism not by its ideology, right, but by its emotional components.
Yes, he argues that populism requires three distinct elements to really achieve critical mass. First, an intense generalized anger. Second, a deliberate ambiguity about the actual solutions. And third, a panicked, overwhelming urge among the public to just do something, anything, immediately.
It is the ultimate seduction of simplicity. I was reading this section of Forwood's book, and the best way I can conceptualize it is to compare populism to a radical crash diet.
Oh, that is actually a really apt parallel. Let's explore that.
Think about the psychology of it. You feel terrible, you are exhausted, your clothes don't fit, and you are deeply frustrated with your physical state.
The status quo is painful.
Exactly. Deep down in your rational brain, you know the actual solution is the slow, boring, institutional work. You need to eat balanced meals, establish a sleep schedule, maintain a consistent exercise routine for 6 months.
That is the legislative process of health.
It is unglamorous, it requires daily discipline, and the results are incremental.
Fraught with friction.
Yes, fraught with friction. And then at your absolute most vulnerable moment, you see an advertisement for a crash diet.
The easy fix.
The pitch is incredibly simple and emotionally validating. It tells you your body is toxic. The food pyramid is a lie. Stop eating solid food immediately. Drink nothing but cayenne pepper and lemon juice for a week, and you will shed 20 pounds.
Notice the components there. The anger is directed at the toxic status quo, the solution is ambiguously scientific, and the action is immediate and drastic.
And it is so seductive because it offers an easy answer to a highly complex biological problem. So you try it. And maybe for the first 48 hours, you feel this massive rush of adrenaline.
You feel righteous.
You feel like you are finally taking control. But what is the actual mechanical result of that crash diet? You don't achieve sustainable health. You cannibalize your own muscle mass, you ruin your metabolic rate, and you place immense stress on your vital organs.
You fundamentally break the system.
Right. That biological degradation maps perfectly onto Forwood's view of how populism degrades the political metabolism of a state.
The populist cry in every era is almost identical. It's always, we cannot go on like this, or only I can fix this right now.
As Forwood notes, the populist rallying cry always sounds intensely righteous in the moment. It feels like liberation.
Until the institutions collapse and the reality of the vacuum sets in.
To prove that this crash diet always ends in organ failure, basically, Forwood takes us into an incredibly deep, sweeping historical analysis.
He's very careful to distinguish between different types of historical uprisings, which is a crucial step.
I found that totally fascinating, because if you say uprising or revolution, people tend to just lump them all together. But Forwood makes a strict delineation between anti-colonial uprisings and utopian or populist overhauls.
This is one of the most vital structural distinctions in the entire book. Forwood acknowledges that not all rebellion is a populist trap. He isolates anti-colonial movements, he heavily cites the American Revolution and India's long struggle against the British Empire, and places them in an entirely separate category.
So why are they exempt from the trap?
Because of the underlying mechanics of what they were actually trying to achieve. Anti-colonial uprisings were efforts to claim autonomy by removing an external, foreign ruler.
An outside force.
Yes, they were not inherently attempting to tear down the fundamental fabric of their own society. In the American context, they wanted to remove the British crown, but they largely maintained the pre-existing economic and social structures of the colonies to build a new republic.
They were fighting for self-governance, not a theoretical top-to-bottom re-engineering of human nature. Okay, that makes sense. You are firing the incompetent CEO who lives across the ocean, but you are keeping the company intact and letting the local managers run it.
That's a great way to view it.
But then he contrasts that with the utopian overhauls, which he identifies as the true manifestation of the populist trap.
Yes, and the examples he explores here are incredibly heavy and historically bloody. He zeroes in on the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
Major historical upheavals.
Forwood categorizes these not merely as transfers of power, but as complete regime overhauls driven by massive internal populist outrage and intoxicating utopian promises.
I have to pause here because grouping those three together is definitely going to raise some eyebrows. Putting the French Revolution in the exact same bucket as the Bolsheviks feels like a massive historical provocation.
Oh, he expects pushback on that.
I mean, we are conditioned to romanticize the French Revolution. It's Les Miserables, it's the storming of the Bastille, it's the Declaration of the Rights of Man. We are taught that it was this glorious, enlightened triumph of liberty over a corrupt monarchy.
It is absolutely romanticized in Western pop culture, but Forwood demands we look past the Enlightenment branding and focus strictly on the methodology of the revolution and its ultimate result.
The actual outcome.
He groups the French, the Russian, and the Iranian revolutions together based on a very specific, grim metric. How did they handle the reality of governance once the initial uprising succeeded?
And the answer is horribly.
Exactly. They all succumbed to the populist trap because they were chasing a utopia. When you promise a perfect society, whether it is perfect equality in France, a perfect workers' paradise in Russia, or a perfect theocracy in Iran, any failure to achieve that perfection cannot be blamed on the complexity of reality.
Because the vision is perfect.
Right. So it must be blamed on saboteurs.
Wow. Because the crash diet has to work, so if you aren't losing weight, it's because someone is secretly feeding you bread.
Precisely. And so the methodology shifts from governing to purging. The French Revolution promised liberty and equality, but the populist mechanism demanded absolute purity, which led directly to the Reign of Terror.
The moderate reformers were devoured by the Jacobins.
The guillotine ran day and night, and the chaos only ended when a military dictator, Napoleon, seized control.
It is the exact same arc with the Bolsheviks. The populist promise was the empowerment of the proletariat and the end of czarist oppression.
And the reality?
The reality was the systemic eradication of anyone deemed a class enemy, the establishment of the Gulag system, and the totalizing authoritarianism of Joseph Stalin.
And in 1979, the Iranian Revolution utilized a massive, broad-based populist anger against the brutality of the Shah. It included leftists, students, and moderates.
A huge coalition.
But the utopian energy was ultimately monopolized by the most extreme faction, leading to purges, executions, and the establishment of an inflexible authoritarian theocracy.
So what's the takeaway here?
Forwood's immutable rule is this: when populism is the vehicle and utopia is the destination, you will inevitably crash into authoritarianism. The simplicity of the populist promise simply cannot survive the friction of actual human society without resorting to brutal systemic force.
It is an incredibly sobering lens. It completely strips the romance away from the idea of tearing it all down.
It does.
But what makes Forwood's work so terrifying is that he doesn't leave us in 18th century Paris or 1917 Petrograd. He argues that this populist trap is constantly setting itself up in modern democracies.
We aren't immune.
No, we don't have to look to monarchies or empires to see how the demand for an easy answer leads to disaster. He maps out 4 brutal, modern historical case studies from recent history.
These case studies are the backbone of his argument because they demonstrate how populism operates as a completely nonpartisan tool. It is entirely agnostic to left or right. It only cares about the vulnerability of the institutions.
Let's examine his first modern case study, Richard Nixon and the expansion of the Vietnam War.
Okay, so case study 1. We're in the late 1960s. The country is being torn apart by the Vietnam War. The institutional process has produced a complete quagmire.
The public is exhausted, angry, and demanding a solution. Enter Richard Nixon with an incredibly potent, profoundly simple populist promise: peace and honor.
It is a masterclass in populist ambiguity. It acknowledges the deep pain of the status quo without offering a complex, friction-filled diplomatic roadmap. It simply promises the destination.
I will give you peace, and I will ensure we keep our honor.
It completely bypasses the agonizing reality of a geopolitical withdrawal.
But the reality of how Nixon attempted to execute that populist promise is where the trap snaps shut. Forwood details how the demand for a quick fix led Nixon to circumvent the institutional checks and balances of the United States government.
The solution wasn't a brilliant peace treaty.
No, it was a massive campaign of secret, illegal carpet bombings in neutral Cambodia.
The mechanism here is crucial. Because the populist mandate was peace and honor, the executive branch felt perfectly justified in hiding its actions from the legislative branch.
The institutional oversight was viewed as an obstacle to the populist goal.
And the result of bypassing those institutions? It didn't bring peace. It massively destabilized the entire Southeast Asian region, arguably paving the way for the Khmer Rouge.
And for the United States, it extended the conflict and resulted in roughly 20,000 additional American casualties.
The easy populist answer resulted in a catastrophic expansion of the tragedy.
It perfectly illustrates the gap between the simplicity of the slogan and the destructive reality of the execution.
And Forwood's second case study takes us to the darkest possible manifestation of this dynamic. It demonstrates how populist anger can be harnessed to entirely incinerate a democratic republic from within.
The rise of Adolf Hitler in Weimar Germany.
When we talk about Nazi Germany, we so often focus on the endgame, the total war, the Holocaust. But Forwood forces us to look at the mechanics of the ascension.
Right, how it actually started.
In the late 1920s and early 30s, the Weimar Republic was struggling. It was economically devastated, culturally divided, and the institutional government was essentially paralyzed by constant fracturing elections.
The institutional friction was at an absolute maximum, and into that paralysis, Hitler injected a pure populist promise: economic revival and national unity.
But the mechanism of that unity was heavily predicated on the aggressive, relentless scapegoating of minorities, specifically Jewish people, as well as communist and institutional elites.
It was the promise to restore national pride by identifying and punishing an internal enemy who was supposedly causing all the friction.
What I found most chilling in Forwood's analysis of this era is the mathematics of the populist trap. He emphasizes a statistic that we often forget.
Oh, this blew my mind.
Hitler did not march into Berlin and seize power with a massive, overwhelming democratic mandate from the majority of the population.
He never won a majority in a free election. He took the chancellorship with his party holding less than 40% of the vote.
Less than 40%. But Forwood's crucial insight is that while he only had a plurality of the vote, he managed to capitalize on 100% of the anger.
Exactly. This is how the methodology of extremism operates. Hitler did not need 51% of the electorate to agree with his ideology.
He just needed a monopoly on the populist fury.
He weaponized that highly motivated, deeply aggressive minority to intimidate the center, exhaust the institutions, and eventually dismantle the republic from the inside using the republic's own emergency powers.
He used the tools of the democracy to kill the democracy, powered entirely by the energy of populist grievance.
It is the ultimate warning that you don't need a majority to break a country. You just need the loudest, most uncompromising faction.
Now, it is easy to look at the Weimar Republic and think, well, that was a unique historical anomaly. That kind of vulnerability doesn't exist in a modern, stable superpower.
But Forwood pulls us right into the 21st century for his third case study. And this one is uncomfortable to read because it requires us to look at our own recent behavior. Case study 3 is post-9/11 America.
This is undoubtedly his most potent example of how populism transcends the traditional partisan divide. It illustrates how trauma can instantly override institutional caution.
He asks us to try and place ourselves back in the emotional atmosphere of the United States in the weeks and months immediately following the September 11th attacks.
The atmosphere was suffocating, the entire country was terrified, collectively grieving, and incredibly vulnerable.
And the resulting fury was entirely bipartisan. There was no left-wing or right-wing approach to the grief. It was a unified national demand that our government do something. We needed an aggressive, visible response to prove that we were safe.
It was a massive collective slide into the populist trap. The ambiguity was high, the anger was absolute, and the urge to act was overwhelming.
And Forwood details exactly how that populist momentum was translated into policy. It completely bypassed the normal skeptical friction of the legislative process.
The government rapidly passed the Patriot Act, fundamentally altering domestic surveillance, and launched two massive sprawling wars in the Middle East.
He focuses heavily on the staggering metrics of this populist reaction, because the reality of the easy answer to terrorism resulted in a two-decade quagmire.
We're looking at a financial expenditure of nearly $6 trillion.
The human cost is almost unfathomable. Over 7,000 American service members lost, and hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties across Iraq, Afghanistan, and the wider region.
But the statistic Forwood highlights to prove this was a populist phenomenon, and not just an executive overreach, is the public polling. At the onset of the Iraq War, it had over 70% public support.
70%. It was a supermajority of consensus.
Today, with the benefit of hindsight, you can find people across the entire political spectrum who will readily admit that the invasion of Iraq was a monumental strategic error.
But Forward reminds us that in that specific post-9/11 moment, it didn't feel like an error. It felt utterly necessary. It felt urgent.
The populist demand for a simple, aggressive, kinetic answer to a complex, terrifying geopolitical trauma simply overwhelmed the institutional immune system.
We demanded action, and the system gave us a catastrophe to satisfy the demand.
It proves that populism isn't just about angry rallies. It is about the suspension of critical thinking in the face of fear.
Which leads directly into Forwood's fourth case study, another period where American fear was weaponized to bypass institutional norms, McCarthyism in the 1950s.
We are in the early days of the Cold War. The nuclear threat is real, the Soviet Union is expanding, and there's a genuine ambient anxiety about national security.
The populist promise here was simple. I will protect you by rooting out the hidden enemy within.
Senator Joseph McCarthy positioned himself as the sole, courageous defender of American democracy against a silent, insidious communist infiltration of the government and the culture.
The methodology here is purely populist. McCarthy didn't rely on the slow, meticulous evidentiary process of actual counterintelligence or legal prosecution.
He relied on the spectacle of the accusation. He weaponized ambiguity and panic to bypass the burden of proof.
The reality was the creation of a suffocating culture of paranoia. Thousands of Americans had their careers and lives utterly ruined, not based on hard evidence of espionage, but on suspicion, association, and the insatiable need to feed the populist panic.
And Forwood uses a very specific historical artifact to illustrate how this manipulation functions visually.
Yes, he directs the reader to a highly publicized photograph from June 9, 1954. It is an image of Senator McCarthy during the Army McCarthy hearings.
And he is holding a pointer, gesturing toward a large map.
He is literally pointing to a map of the United States that is covered in ominous markings, supposedly illustrating the vast, sprawling network of communist influence operating in the shadows.
It is such a brilliant, manipulative piece of political theater.
He is taking an abstract, invisible fear subversion and giving it a physical, tangible shape. He is using a prop to validate the paranoia of his followers.
It doesn't matter if the data on the map is entirely fabricated. The image of the map satisfies the populist demand for certainty.
If we synthesize these four distinct case studies, Nixon's secret bombings in Cambodia, Hitler's weaponization of minority anger in Weimar, the catastrophic post-9/11 rush into two wars, and McCarthy's paranoid map, what is the underlying connective tissue?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the connecting mechanism is that populism, in every single manifestation, strictly enforces binary thinking.
It absolutely refuses to acknowledge complexity.
It forces an us versus them reality, whether them is the Vietnamese, the Jewish population, the terrorists, or the hidden communists.
It creates a narrative so rigid, so emotionally charged, and so devoid of nuance that it completely short-circuits the rational institutional processes of a society.
The friction of democracy is erased by the blinding, destructive light of the populist narrative.
It is incredible to look at those four examples back to back. You realize almost instantly that the traditional left versus right political spectrum is completely useless in explaining them.
You can't chart McCarthyism and the French Revolution on a straight horizontal line and make any sense of the underlying human behavior.
The straight line is a dangerous illusion. So, if the spectrum isn't a line, what is the actual shape of our political reality?
This is where Forwood introduces his central thesis, the framework that attempts to accurately map how political energy actually flows. He calls it the circle model.
This is the core of the book, and I want everyone listening to really try and visualize this architecture with us. We are going to mentally deconstruct the diagram Forwood provides. Throw away the horizontal line.
Instead, imagine a complete circle, a continuous loop.
The geometry is vital here. Let's start at the very top of this circle. The entire top arc is shaded in a calm, moderate purple.
Forwood labels this vast top section most of America.
Inside this purple zone, he lists 4 distinct sociological traits: mainstream, realist, compromise, and rule follower. This is the institutional zone.
This top section represents the people who, regardless of whether they might lean slightly left or slightly right on a specific policy, fundamentally believe in the viability of the system.
They operate in the reality of the present moment.
They accept that they will not get everything they want, which means they accept the necessity of compromise. They believe the rules, however flawed, are what keeps society from collapsing.
Okay, now let's trace the political shifts. If you move your attention down the left side of the circle, the purple fades into a solid blue. This is the liberal curve.
If you move down the right side, the purple fades into a solid red. This is the conservative curve.
If you stop there, halfway down, it still somewhat resembles the traditional spectrum, just bent on a curve. You have liberals on one side wanting progressive policies and conservatives on the other wanting traditional policies.
But here's where it gets really interesting. It is what happens when you continue down to the bottom of the circle that completely shatters the old paradigm.
This is the massive revelation. As you continue to travel down the blue liberal side and down the red conservative side, they don't stay infinitely far apart.
Because it is a circle, those two lines curve inward.
The further away you get from the moderate top, the closer the left and the right curve back toward each other until they physically intersect at the very bottom.
And Forwood shades this entire bottom intersection in a dark, ominous black.
He labels this bottom zone the loud minority. And the traits he lists down here are the exact inversions of the top. Instead of mainstream, you have fringe.
Instead of realist, you have conspiracy.
Instead of compromise, you have no compromise. And instead of rule follower, you have anarchist. This is the extremist zone.
The most crucial mechanical insight of this visual is that at the absolute bottom of the circle, the far left and the far right occupy the exact same physical and psychological space.
The domain of the fringe, the conspiratorial thinking, the absolute refusal to compromise, the desire to tear the system down, that revolutionary energy is identical.
It does not matter if you slid down the left side of the circle quoting Karl Marx or if you slid down the right side quoting Ayn Rand.
Once you hit the bottom, the ideology evaporates and only the methodology of destruction remains.
It totally rewrites our understanding of how political radicalization happens.
Yeah.
We always use this geographic language. We talk about a voter jumping across the aisle.
Right. We picture someone standing on the extreme far left of a straight line and then suddenly, inexplicably, teleporting thousands of miles to the extreme far right.
Which makes no logical sense.
Mm-hmm.
But Forwood's model explains that nobody jumps across a line, they slide down the curve.
Precisely. To prove how this psychological gravity works, Forwood applies his circle model to 3 highly specific modern political journeys. These are trajectories that confound traditional political scientists using the straight line model, but they map perfectly onto the circle model.
Let's look at the first example. How do you explain a fiercely dedicated Bernie Sanders supporter in 2016 who, a few months later, ends up voting enthusiastically for Donald Trump?
We saw this happen. The data shows it happened.
But on a straight horizontal line, going from advocating for democratic socialism and wealth redistribution to supporting Trump's hyper-capitalist. Conservative populism requires a voter to completely abandon every core belief they hold and leap across the political universe.
But on the circle model, there is no ideological leap. There is only a methodological slide. What actually happened is that this specific voter was already feeling deeply alienated from the moderate top of the circle.
They were exhausted by the establishment Democrats, the slow pace of the rule followers, and the constant compromise that never seemed to improve their daily life.
So they supported Bernie Sanders, moving down the blue liberal curve, looking for a faster, more sweeping change.
Right, but when Sanders failed to secure the nomination, when the institutional immune system of the Democratic Party held and nominated a moderate, that voter did not shrug and travel back up to the top of the circle.
Their frustration metastasized into anger. They kept sliding.
They kept sliding down the left side until they hit the bottom. They entered the dark extremist zone, the zone of no compromise.
And here is the mechanism. Once that voter is at the bottom of the circle, their attachment to progressive policy ceases to be the primary driver of their behavior.
The only thing that matters is populist disruption.
They want to punish the system that frustrated them. And from that very bottom point, it is incredibly easy to make a tiny lateral shift into the populist energy of the Trump movement, waiting right there on the lower right curve.
They didn't suddenly become conservative. They just found a new vehicle for their demolition. They wanted someone to flip the table, and since the left wouldn't provide the table flipper, they hired the one on the right.
It makes terrifying sense. It's not about policy. It's about the emotional resonance of the wrecking ball. This exact same mechanism explains Forwood's second example, which is a profoundly tragic illustration of how the slide works. Ashley Babbitt.
Yes, Ashley Babbitt's trajectory is a deeply devastating case study of the populist gravity well.
When you look at her political history, she was a former Barack Obama voter. She actively supported a moderate institutional Democrat. She resided firmly at the top of the circle in the mainstream compromise zone.
But over the course of several years, her online consumption and social environment began to pull her down the curve.
The algorithmic nature of modern media is highly effective at accelerating this slide.
She descended from the institutional top and was pulled directly into the conspiracy zone at the very bottom.
She became enveloped in QAnon narratives and anti-institutional paranoia. And the result of that slide was that in January of 2021, a former Obama voter tragically lost her life while storming the United States Capitol.
Actively participating in a violent insurrection, attempting to halt the democratic process.
Her journey from an institutional voter to a casualty of a far-right anti-government riot is utterly incomprehensible on a straight line.
It only computes when you realize she descended into the shared conspiratorial darkness at the bottom of the circle, where the only goal is to dismantle the apparatus of the state.
And Forwood provides a third, highly visible modern example that is playing out right now. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yes, RFK Jr. is a fascinating test case.
For decades, he was deeply entrenched on the blue liberal side of the circle. He was a prominent, aggressive, progressive environmentalist. He fought corporate polluters using the court system. He was a quintessential, albeit intense, institutional liberal.
But over the years, his methodology fundamentally shifted. He moved away from institutional legal battles over environmental policy and leaned heavily into medical populism.
He began promoting expansive conspiracy theories, specifically targeting vaccines and the foundational integrity of public health institutions.
He abandoned the realist top of the circle and took an elevator straight down into the fringe bottom.
And what is the result? As Forwood highlights, this former darling of the progressive environmental movement has completely transformed into a celebrated figure within right-wing media ecosystems.
He is being embraced by the exact same conservative populists who are also operating near the bottom of the circle.
What is so vital to understand about all three of these trajectories, the Sanders to Trump voter, Ashley Babbitt, and RFK Jr., is that the specific political ideology they started with did not matter in the end.
The defining characteristic of their journey was a shared, profound rejection of the compromise zone.
They abandoned the frustrating, agonizingly slow work of the builders at the top in favor of the intoxicating, destructive, no-compromise energy waiting at the bottom.
So what does this all mean? We have systematically dismantled the left-right spectrum. We have walked through the bloody historical consequences of utopian populism.
We have mapped out the mechanical reality of the circle model and seen how the extremes intersect. This brings us to the ultimate question. How do we synthesize all of this?
How do we take Forwood's incredibly dense framework and actually use it to navigate the news cycle tomorrow morning?
Exactly. The application of this theory requires us to adopt a completely new vocabulary.
The first step is to internalize Forwood's most unyielding conclusion about the fundamental nature of populism. And it is a harsh truth to accept. Populism breaks things. It does not build.
It is entirely structurally destructive.
It is capable only of creating moments of intense disruption, not movements of lasting governance. It is perfectly designed to generate the fiery, cathartic protest in the street, but it is fundamentally incapable of generating the complex, sustainable policy in the legislature.
No matter how many utopian promises a populist makes, no matter how beautifully they describe the world they want to create, their only actual competency is demolition.
Which leads directly to Forwood's replacement for the traditional left versus right paradigm. He argues that we must entirely stop asking what side someone is on.
We shouldn't care if a politician is wearing a red tie or a blue tie. The new binary, the only diagnostic question that actually matters when evaluating a politician, a pundit, a piece of legislation, or a social movement is this. Are they a builder or are they a burner?
That is the crux of the entire book. The defining struggle of our time is builders versus burners.
Let's clearly define those terms within Forward's architecture. A builder is an entity operating at the top of the circle. They want to improve the system.
This does not mean they think the system is perfect. In fact, builders are acutely aware of the flaws.
But they believe in the slow, grueling, often frustrating work of institutional reform. They are willing to sit in the committee hearing. They are willing to accept the friction.
They're the people who will compromise to get half a loaf of bread today, rather than burn down the entire bakery in the hope that a better bakery will magically appear tomorrow.
And conversely, a burner is an entity operating at the very bottom of the circle. They have looked at the slow, painful pace of the builders, declared the entire enterprise a failure, and decided their only viable option is to tear the system down.
Their ideology is demolition. Their entire political strategy is to generate enough fire to collapse the structure, and then pray that something miraculously better rises from the ashes.
I have to pause and genuinely challenge Forwood's conclusion here. Because the framework of builders versus burners is incredibly compelling, but it relies on the assumption that the structure is actually worth saving.
It's a fair question to ask.
What if the system is genuinely structurally corrupted beyond repair? What if the institutions are so captured by special interests or so inefficient at alleviating human suffering that the builders are essentially just applying fresh coats of paint to a house that is entirely eaten by termites?
Doesn't Forwood's strict reliance on institutionalism trap a society in a broken system forever, simply out of a paralyzing fear of the ashes?
Exactly. If we never allow the burners to clear the rot, don't we just suffer a slow, suffocating decline?
It is a totally valid, deeply human challenge to his theory, and it is the exact rationalization that every populist revolutionary in human history has deployed. The system is too broken to fix, therefore we must destroy it.
So how does Forward counter that?
He grounds his rebuttal not in theory, but strictly in the empirical text of history. History is the ultimate unforgiving judge of the burner's argument.
What is history's verdict?
Forwood warns, and I'm summarizing his central thesis here, that history tells us exactly what rises from the ashes of these populist infernos, and it is rarely anything resembling a utopia.
The beautiful dream never materializes from the rubble.
Instead of a new, equitable society, the ashes produce Robespierre and the guillotine. They produce Stalin and the purges. They produce decades of authoritarian regression, economic collapse, and immense human suffering.
The cure is mathematically proven to be infinitely worse than the disease.
Exactly. The core of Forwood's defense of the builder is that the chaos, the bloodshed, and the systemic collapse inflicted by a burner will always, historically, outweigh the deep frustration caused by the slow pace of an institutional builder.
The institution may be maddeningly slow, it may be deeply flawed, and it may fail to meet the immediate needs of the moment. But tearing it down via populist rage only guarantees suffering. It never guarantees salvation.
It fundamentally forces you to reevaluate every political instinct you possess. It forces you to look at your own frustrations and ask if you are indulging in the desire to burn.
Let's recap the massive intellectual journey we have taken today through Herman Forwood's The Populist Trap. We started by completely dismantling the illusion of the straight left-to-right political spectrum, realizing it blinds us to the real threat.
We established the 2026 baseline, recognizing that the true divide is not left versus right, but rather institutionalists attempting to navigate the friction of democracy versus revolutionaries attempting to dismantle the machinery entirely.
We analyzed the profound, seductive danger of populism, that political crash diet that thrives on anger, ambiguity, and the panic demand for immediate action.
We traced that destructive energy through history, drawing a stark line between anti-colonial struggles for actual autonomy and the catastrophic bloody utopian overhauls of the French, Russian, and Iranian revolutions.
We examined the mechanics of failure in 4 brutal, modern case studies. Nixon bypassing Congress to bomb Cambodia, Hitler weaponizing a plurality of anger to destroy the Weimar Republic from within, the staggering cost of the post-9/11 bipartisan populist panic, and the unchecked paranoia fueled by McCarthy's map.
We took all of that evidence and built the circle model, visualizing exactly how the extremes of the far left and far right physically meet at the bottom of the curve in a dark zone defined by conspiracy and a refusal to compromise.
And we used that model to decode the seemingly impossible political journeys of voters sliding from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump, the tragic radicalization of Ashley Babbitt, and the conspiratorial descent of RFK Jr.
And finally, we arrived at Forwood's ultimate diagnostic lens, the absolute necessity of adopting the builder versus burner mindset and abandoning the partisan red and blue tribalism entirely.
So, here is our call to action for you, the listener, as you step back into the chaotic reality of modern media. We want you to take Forwood's circle model out into the world. The very next time you watch a fiery political speech, whether it is a highly produced clip on your social media feed, a debate stage, or a pundit screaming on a news network, force yourself to look past the partisan branding.
Ignore the logo on the screen.
Ask yourself one structural question. Is this person offering the hard, slow, frustrating, compromise-filled work of the top of the circle? Or are they offering the seductive, righteous, destructive simplicity of the bottom? Are they handing you a blueprint to build, or are they handing you a match to burn?
As we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative question. This is a concept to mull over that builds directly on Forwood's core warning about the tension between the slow pace of institutional builders and the immediate demands of the public.
We have established that populism thrives in the gap between what people want and how fast the democratic government can actually deliver it.
The friction of waiting is the vulnerability.
Precisely. So consider the specific neurological and cultural reality of the modern era we are living in right now.
We exist in a society built entirely around absolute frictionless instant gratification. We demand same-day delivery for our physical goods. We expect instant streaming of infinite entertainment. We require immediate dopamine-driven responses to our digital communications.
If Forwood is correct that populism is fueled by a society's inability to tolerate the slow grind of process, does our modern algorithm-driven culture of instant gratification make us biologically more vulnerable to the populist trap than any other generation in human history?
Oh, that is a terrifying proposition.
Have our brains been so thoroughly rewired by the speed of commerce and social media that we are physically, neurochemically incapable of accepting the slow builder mindset anymore? Have we literally lost the attention span required for the friction of democracy to actually function?
If we cannot tolerate waiting 2 days for a package to arrive, how on earth can we tolerate waiting 2 years for a complex housing bill to navigate a congressional subcommittee?
That is an incredibly heavy, vital thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of our political reality. We genuinely hope this framework helps you cut through the noise and recognize the shape of the arguments being sold to you. Stay curious, keep looking for the builders, and we will catch you next time.